welcome. We're very glad you could be here for this discussion of analytical Marxism and democratic socialism in the 21st century, which is deeply inspired by our reading of G.A. Cohen, in particular in the forthcoming volume that is going to be coming out in a couple of weeks, which is a bit hard to believe, actually.
It's been a very long time.
It's been a very long time, several universities ago for me in that case, right? The way that this is going to break down is myself and Dr. Burgis, we're very briefly going to talk a bit about the inspiration behind this volume, in particular why we think it's important to revisit G.A. Cohen's legacy in these troubling times. And then each of the participants for this volume that are here are going to talk a little bit about their paper and how it resonates with contemporary political events. And then, of course, we'll have the fun part of this, which is the Q&A and all that. Dr. Burgis and myself envisioned this volume for quite a long time ago, actually, right? We've always had...
I was living in Atlanta many life events ago when you first brought up the idea. It was 2022?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, it was when I first floated it, right? It's kind of surreal, actually, to finally see it come to fruition, right? But the main thing that was an impetus for it was twofold, right? First was the very clear fact that reactionary politics in the United States and in much of the rest of the world wasn't going anywhere. Many of us had hoped in 2020 that Trumpism had turned out to just be a blip in the radar, kind of fly in the ointment, and everybody was going to wake up collectively a little bit hungover, and then that would be the be-all and end-all of it. Around 2022 and 2023, it became sadly obvious to many of us on the progressive end of the political spectrum that this was not going to happen. That Trumpism was here to stay, and many other forms of right-wing populism actually seem to be taking impetus and inspiration from his populist and authoritarian gestures. And that led to the second inspiration, which is how is it that liberals and progressives and Marxists should respond to the rising trends in right-wing populism. And G.A. Cohen might seem like an unusual pick to respond to these events, but what really attracted myself and Dr. Burgis to him was the combination of analytical rigor that his work has always displayed, and enormous moral power and force, which I think many of us think is often lacking, unfortunately, from many of the more critical iterations of left-wing theory that are very good, as Mark Hamill once put it, at trashing the society we live in, but not necessarily the best at indicating what should replace the society that we live in a comprehensive way. So Cohen, of course, is well known for his articulate defense not only of the analytical Marxist approach to history in his famous book on that subject, but of his moral defense of democratic socialism, grounded in several different principles, most notably a principle of community, a principle of liberty or freedom, and of course a principle of community. I think that personally all three of these principles can be understood as ultimately deriving their power from the legacy of the Enlightenment, particularly the revolutionary principles of liberty, equality, and fraternity. And I think that one of the key goals in this volume is to demonstrate that all Enlightenment doctrines need to be on watch right now against these various irrational forces that are currently trying to undo this project, which means that we should be looking at what conciliates between all of us with the ambition of hoping to be producing a more progressive politics for the future. So that was my ambition when crafting this volume, and I'm really proud of all the contributors that have really offered some truly seminal kind of examinations of the subject matter. And I'll pass it on to Ben.
Yeah, I think that maybe in my case, I was thinking less about the politics of the here and now, as regards Cohen, and more just sort of long-term theoretical obsessions. Although of course, one hopes that those obsessions will ultimately serve a better politics in the here and now. Otherwise, what's the point? But I always suspected this volume was Matt's idea. He floated it to me originally. But I always suggested that part of the reason is that I've contributed to several other books that Matt has edited over the years, and I keep on writing about Cohen over and over again, and so I think eventually he was like, well, let's just do something on Cohen, so, you could be on topic for once, buddy. It's, I think it was really exciting to do, because, I learned a lot from the contributors. We had people who in the volume who were students of Cohen. We had Christine, who's recently written a book, about Cohen's political philosophy, and so this is a figure, I've been very fixated on for a long time, but this is also the best possible kind of editing experience when you're actually learning a lot, from what you're reading as an editor.
Absolutely. And I should say, last but not least, one of my personal inspirations for this was my supervisor was a Cohen student, and for a long time I remember you and I used to talk a lot about Cohen and some of the anecdotes around him and what it was like for you to be supervised. And so I thought there was a bit of a touching genealogy there also that I was looking to tap into. So that was our inspiration for the book, right? And I'm going to go into some detail about my paper and related to another project that I'm working on to try to kind of demonstrate the conceptual links between the two, and Ben will also talk a little bit about his own approach to this. But right now we just wanted to pass it on to our other contributors, and I think we were going to start with Christine and her contribution to our paper.
Cool, great, thanks. Well, thanks very much, Matt and Ben, for organizing the book, and also for organizing this occasion. It's unfortunate the book launch does not have a book yet physically present to be launched, but the book is here in spirit, I guess. That's the idea, and hopefully it will be in everyone's hot little hands before too long. So I wrote a book, as Ben mentioned, on Jerry Cohen, which was published about a year and a half ago. This is it. And I also edited a book in honor of Cohen with essays from some of his largely Oxford colleagues. My essay in the book that Ben and Matt have edited is on Cohen's idea of socialist justice, and I look at that from the point of view of both distributive justice and justice in the sense of legality. And it picks up on some of the themes of my book, as you might expect. And in the book, I explored Cohen's thought in terms of paradoxes. And one paradox that makes him such an engaging political philosopher was that Cohen, as was stressed by you both, his analytical rigor, his emphasis on precision and clarity, founder of the school of analytical Marxism, and which Cohen liked to call the no bullshit Marxists, which actually implies there's a certain amount of bullshit among Marxists, which is an interesting question. Maybe we'll get into that problem and why Cohen thought that. But at the same time, despite that emphasis on rigor and clarity and analytical precision, which sounds a little austere, Cohen was such an engaging person, and that personality comes through in his writings, because his writings were full of anecdotes and recollections and lyrics from Union songs and stories about his family and so forth. And so much as Cohen was influenced and inspired by the feminist slogan, "The personal is political," I also say for him, the political was personal, and that has a lot to do with his background. So the reason why his writings were so peppered by his personality was that he had such an interesting life. He grew up in a working class communist community, Jewish communist community in Montreal. And his parents were very much oriented to the Soviet Union, to Moscow, really orthodox Marxists, active in the Communist Party. And so when the Soviet Union collapsed, Cohen was sort of surprisingly distressed by it, because he had actually become quite disillusioned with the Soviet Union, as you might expect, certainly after 1968. But he nonetheless said, and I'll just quote this really, what I thought was a very touching remark. It's true that I was heavily critical of the Soviet Union, but the little boy who pummels his father's chest will not be glad if the old man collapses. So a lovely remark, but of course, riling against this authoritarian, tyrannical regime that was such a betrayal of Marxist ideals, but then when it collapses, there's this kind of ideological vacuum. which prompted a lot of responses, I think, because Samuel Bowles says, we're partying, what a relief, we don't have to, think that socialism is that anymore. But at the same time, in the context of the Cold War, there was suddenly the left didn't have a place to think about or be oriented to. So Cohen also said that I think with the collapse of the Soviet Union and the removal of that sort of lodestar for his family, he took the view that historical materialism was increasingly problematic as a doctrine about social change and human progress. So he had written a book about Marx, as was mentioned, about Marx's historical materialism, which he thought of as a kind of tribute to his family and his background, the sort of best way to defend historical materialism. He gave an account of that. But he took the view that what he called the obstetric approach to social change, where the working class presides over the inevitable birth of the communist society, was in a way irresponsible, that really you needed normative political philosophy that made a moral case for socialism. And so that's what he then turned himself to doing. I think a couple of other factors was the ways in which working class voters were voting for right-wing parties in the 1980s, and of course that's only more in evidence of late. And also the environmental crisis, where the assumption of surplus was certainly put into question, which was always key in the Marxist story about the transition from capitalism to communism. So Cohen, embracing normative political philosophy, which he hadn't initially, writes about the libertarian Robert Nozick, some really trenchant critiques of Nozick's libertarianism. And then what he devotes himself most principally is the political philosophy of John Rawls. And I think it's the thing that makes that is the impetus for Cohen's work on Rawls is Rawls's concession to incentives. So Rawls famously has two principles of justice. The second principle says that inequalities are justified so long as the worst off benefit. You might be puzzled, how would the worst off benefit from inequality? And it's, at first you think there must be some kind of technical reason, but then actually Rawls says almost in passing, well, if it turns out that human psychology is such that the only way to have a productive society with ample resources is to permit the high flyers, as Cohen called them, the particularly productive and talented, to be rewarded financially more than any account of equality would think they were entitled to. If that's the only way to have a productive society that could attend to the worst off and amply provide for them, then we should permit incentives. And that was around the same time, too, that the Thatcher government was, and right-wing governments everywhere were saying, of course, you can't tax the rich too much because then they won't be productive, and this is trickle-down type economics. So Cohen was really disillusioned that Rawls made that concession. It seemed so contrary to Rawls's argument that people's capacity to make money was part of a natural lottery. It was kind of arbitrary and contingent fact, not a matter of moral desert. So Cohen said that it may be that in the real world we have to make that concession, but then what we're doing is we're providing an account of rules of regulation, not principles of justice. And in fact, Cohen was so convinced that principles of justice really demanded that people abstain or constrain their impulse for greater reward, that he penned a very famous essay, "If You're an Egalitarian, How Come You're So Rich?" The idea that, contrary to most left-wing suppositions that distributive justice is a matter of institutions, he said it's also a matter of personal obligations to do your part. Now that makes for a pretty demanding account of equality, an account of equality which involves a social ethos where we're all committed to this idea of a socialist community where distribution is on the basis of need. So one of the things that I found quite disappointing about Cohen much as I admired his work, was his turn to look at egalitarianism. Because I thought that was at such odds with this rich, ambitious idea of the egalitarian community. And I'm not sure how much you know about that school of thought, some of you might not. It's the view that when we're trying to figure out how to realize egalitarian principles, we should take into account the sources of inequality. And in particular, we should be interested in whether people are disadvantaged as a result of circumstances beyond their control, or as a result of choices or gambles that they deliberately made. So this means, by the bar of justice, if you are disadvantaged as a result of imprudent or reckless decisions, then you do not, as far as justice is concerned, merit amelioration of your disadvantage. Now, Cohen did say there's a principle of community that pulls in another direction, but it looks like justice has this strings attached account. That is, there are certain conditions that have to be met in order for your disadvantage to be remedied. And I always thought this was a terrible betrayal of what is in so many ways such an ambitious and rich understanding of socialism, and socialism as an egalitarian community. Instead of Marxism, from each according to their ability, to each according to their needs, I always joke it sounds more like Stalin's credo, those who do not work do not eat. And it was also sort of surprising in that Cohen's own personality seems so at odds with this. He was famous for being very generous to those in need. He would give to beggars on the street. In fact, he would famously hand over a £5 note and say, "You must spend this on alcohol," to sort of undermine the usual moralistic understanding of charity as somehow requiring, the deserving poor type idea. So how to reconcile that with this embrace of egalitarianism? I was talking about this with Jonathan Wolfe, who said, Ronald Dworkin is to blame. And let's blame Ronald Dworkin on that. I think maybe real world considerations, much as he thought of political philosophy as an analytical exercise, and not really an exercise in shaping social movements particularly, but I think that point that I made earlier about the decline of working class support for left-wing parties meant that he was moved by the worry that working class people would see the welfare state and socialism as giving to the undeserving, the problem of welfare bums. And indeed, there's a quote that Nicholas Rosales and I both like to invoke, where he says, so Cohen was influenced by Ronald Dworkin in embracing egalitarianism, and he says, Dworkin has in effect performed for egalitarianism the considerable service of incorporating within it the most powerful idea in the arsenal of the anti-egalitarian right, the idea of choice and responsibility. So it seems that maybe the real world was weighing on him there, and he thought this was a way of responding to that. It may be that worry about clipping the wings perhaps of the socialist project in light of the real world context might also be why Cohen doesn't say more about his idea of access to advantage, something else I talk about in my essay. Access to advantage is what he thinks we're trying to make more equal. And one of the things about it is that you can see some links with the socialist understanding of the ideal socialist community to be one where we have all-round development, where we self-realize, we engage in creative labor, we have relationships of fraternity. And Cohen didn't really push that very far. He certainly didn't tackle Rawls's abstinence on those questions. And Cohen did say that the question political philosophy addresses is not what to do, but what to think, even when what we think makes no difference to practice. So I think we have an interesting kind of a paradox between the real world sometimes seemed to weigh on Cohen in terms of what he embraced and how he negotiated his political and philosophical interests, but also his insistence that ultimately we shouldn't be doing rules and regulations, we should be thinking of principles of justice, and indeed those principles of justice, he said, should be ultimately fact-independent, very sort of metaphysically peculiar view that lots of people were very critical of. But philosophizing about the ideal, I think, is more motivating than Cohen might think. So that distinction between what to think rather than what to do maybe is overdrawn. Think of the current context and the cost of living crisis. In fact, we're not stressing personal responsibility. We're not worried about personal responsibility, whether people made the right choices, whether they were prudent when they say they can't afford to put food on the table for their families. So I think like egalitarianism actually kind of misreads the political climate, certainly the current one. I don't hear that welfare bum rhetoric right now. I think that's just seems so beside the point in the current context. And as well, I think we're much more conscious that some of those socialist ideals about how to live well seem all the more important. Look at the happiness surveys that have been coming out. Canada's standing has gone down in social media, for example, is among the reasons that people speak of it. It seems that capitalism not only makes for inequality, it makes for deep unhappiness, alienation, loneliness. So I think at a time when irrational thought in the service of inequality, division, and alienation is rampant throughout the world, Cohen's example remains vital, but let us hope that thinkers on the left will carry on Cohen's legacy of astute analytical criticism, but without sacrificing the ideals of community and fellowship so crucial to the ideal of socialist justice. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Christine. So now we're going to hear from Dr. Lesley Jacobs, who has a very interesting and actually quite affecting contribution to make.
Yeah, truthfully, I didn't know what Christine was going to talk about, but it maybe dovetails a bit, and maybe it would appear like there's a lot more kind of agreement. But I'll say a couple of things about Jerry Cohen that you don't normally hear. Well, you don't normally hear when people are talking about academics. One is he was incredibly funny. It's hard to overstate how funny he was, and he was unmatched in terms of his ability to impersonate people, and especially to impersonate other academics. So I mean, there was always a sort of funny piece about him, and in a sense, for somebody who was so serious in a sense about what he did, it was actually a really refreshing kind of sense. He took himself really seriously, but on the other hand, always in the background there was an interesting, and you know, on a sort of pretty personal note, what I sort of took from my experience with him as a graduate student was that in a broader kind of context, certainly in Oxford, but even as an undergraduate in Canada, I didn't find that most academics talked much about their family and so on. And actually, I found that really positive. And he had a terrific interactions with I have 4 kids, with our young kids, and I was always he was always of the view that of course you can balance having a robust family life with being an academic, and it was a sort of an aspect of it, and it's sort of, and on a personal level, he, my wife and I house sat for them like 3 years in a row when they would they would go off, and those were wonderful experiences as a graduate student. Spending time, and Matt knows that, one of the things I took from that was I always have had a history of graduate students house sitting, and it's sort of a, so there's lots of
My second year, I got to house sit his house, and I had this big giant home that I lived in near Broadview Station, and I remember for a little while, I'm like, I must be the coolest person I know.
Anyhow, so I mean, I want to say that the other thing about him is that I was writing about a dissertation on human rights that frankly he didn't really believe in. But he was such a sort of generous academic that that wasn't his kind of role. He did, of course, think a reasonable amount of what I said was bullshit, but that didn't sort of matter to him. There was an openness to, he was constantly criticizing what I wrote, but it was done not because he disagreed about, but because he was really good at marshalling great arguments and critiques. And that's again sort of something that is not typical of a lot of Marxists. And there's sort of a funny footnote to that. When I came back to Canada and started teaching at UBC, I taught there a course a number of years in a row on analytical Marxism. It was fine, but it was not a department that had really almost any Marxism. And when I came to York, I thought, oh, I'll teach a course on analytical Marxism the first term I was here, and it was a disaster. Because, if you're teaching analytical Marxism, you're teaching around really strong critiques of the labor theory of value. You have a measure of skepticism about historical materialism. You have innovative constructions of exploitation that are tied as much to egalitarianism than they are, because they're no longer relying on labor theory of value. There's sort of a interesting sort of nuance, and it was a sort of funny experience about how I never taught that course again. The entire time I was at York, because of the lack of reception, the positive reception it got, particularly among my colleagues in political science. And so those are sort of...
What a coward.
No, I agree with that. Now I can say that. But, I was 20-something, and it was
Fair enough.
a different measure. When I say that I wrote a PhD about human rights, with defense of human rights, like Cohen, I was sort of woken kind of from my sort of, Cohen used to always say, who knows it, woken from his dogmatic slumbers. And Nozick and him and I shared that. But I came from a leftish tradition of Charles Taylor, C.B. McPherson, that kind of tradition that broadly embraced human rights, but through a particular left-wing liberal kind of slant. And Cohen didn't have that, and I sort of highlighted many times how little he has to say about human rights in his corpus. He really says very little about human rights, which is surprising for a sort of in a sort of post-Orwellian, or sort of a in a context where many left-wing critics have some kind of commitment to human rights, whatever else they have. Again, that's shifted, of course, for different reasons, but at the time. And in my paper, I actually, it's written more about the surprise when Why Not Socialism was published, which was published, the book was published just weeks after Cohen died. I hadn't seen that in draft. I don't know, did you see it in draft, Christine?
Well, it was published about 10 years earlier in a collection that Ed Broadbent edited.
Different paper. If you read the two, there are such significant differences. The new one explicitly embraces Locke egalitarianism. That huge,
Yeah.
in my view, huge
Yeah.
difference. And
It was the book, the little book, Why Not Socialism, actually came out the day he died.
oh, was it actually? Yeah, it was. Yeah.
Yeah.
And to the best of my knowledge, he didn't share it very widely before it was published. But I was struck by sort of the two things. One is that in his critique of Rawls, he has very little to say about equality of opportunity, even though it's the first principle, the first part of the second principle. And he rests the argument on his vision of socialist equality of opportunity. And he contrasts it to what he calls a sort of bourgeois view of equality of opportunity, where people just have equal opportunities to become unequal, and what he calls the left egalitarian liberal equality, or left
liberal
equality of opportunity, where people don't benefit from their circumstances, but they can benefit from their natural talents, or something of that sort. And Cohen's argument about socialist equality of opportunity is it's not only you're trying to mitigate for difference in circumstances, things like class and race and so on, but also natural talents. And on the surface, that seems straightforward. But Cohen, because of his sensitivity to the problem that he had pressed with the difference principle in Rawls, argues that the role of community is to set constraints. And in my view, when he looked at the role of human rights in the traditional sort of human rights context of human rights setting constraints on what governments can do and so on, that community, that was the role of community in his sort of framing. But the sort of kicker is, as Christine sort of already alluded to, that Cohen accepts that there can be inequalities under socialist equality of opportunity that can be justified if they're tied to what he calls option luck. So people's gamble. So his example is if two people invest $100 or gamble $100, one person gamble results in $150, somebody else has an outcome of $50, that was an acceptable outcome under equality of opportunity. And the role of community in his view is not about the justice constraint on that, but rather that what the right thing to do within your community is to actually redistribute it back in some sense. But that ultimately that was an issue of voluntary choice, not a requirement of justice. And in my paper, I say, that, imagine that you extrapolate that from that and took somebody, in a Canadian context, two Canadian investors who have $10,000 in 2015. One person invests in NVIDIA, and NVIDIA roughly at valued when I wrote the paper was something going to be like $2.2 million would be the value of that $10,000. I think it's probably now 2.6 million now. And if you'd invested in Intel, again, same line, you would have lost $3,000. You'd have $7,000. Under Cohen's option luck, or luck egalitarianism, you wouldn't have the measures that characterize left liberal equality of opportunity. Left liberal equality of opportunity would readily justify capital gains tax. You would have significant capital gains tax, would redistribute. It's a matter of justice and requirement. And you might argue about what the level of capital gains tax is, but it's very basic principle of left egalitarianism. And it goes back to the kind of argument that underpins people like Taylor, McPherson, that where people, the reasons that those policies are justified and are part of justice is because it's the societal conditions that even enable that at all. That becomes the kind of rationale. Part of my argument about human rights is that's actually why human rights are, in a sense, indivisible, and are not only about rights to basic freedoms, but social rights and so on and so forth. But but that is part of the left liberal tradition around human rights. That human rights are much closely tied together, and it's a funny argument in Cohen, because what luck egalitarianism ultimately kind of reflects is the kind of criticism that Taylor was making about atomism to begin with. That there's a weird kind of way in which for people like Nozick, people are entitled to what they're entitled to, and that's the starting point. And luck egalitarianism, even in Rawls's, or in Cohen's version, still has that funny commitment, and he introduces community later, but it's a funny kind of argument that is weird to hang on a justice argument. Again, not because he's holistically, as you kind of put it, and you and I have talked about this.
Oh, yes.
That the political package on the whole, when you build in community, it's, if you want a particular idea, but from an argument about justice, my inclination is to think that you have constraints on option luck that Cohen doesn't recognize as the demands of justice. And that's the drift of the argument. And like I say, it's kind of a I sort of rhetorically said, described as kind of Cohen's folly around equality of opportunity, because I think that there's just something strange about the non-recognition that a lot of people on the left thought he was nuts about thinking Nozick was so attractive, because he did like Nozick. And I would say, sort of final note is, him and I disagreed regularly on Dworkin. Dworkin never embraced the idea of luck egalitarianism, even though people like Cohen read it into him. He always said, no, I don't subscribe to a luck egalitarianism. And part of it is because Dworkin had a view about things like capital gains. Anyway, that's the drift of the argument.
Yeah, capital gains and clamshells. But yeah, thank you very much, Dr. Jacobs. My presentation is going to be, again, talking about our collection and, the influence of G.A. Cohen on my own work. Pretty much copied and pasted from the paper I contributed to this. But it also draws very heavily from my other book, The Political Theory of Liberal Socialism, which makes the case for retrieving this tradition in a distinctively McPhersonian manner. No need to have read it or anything like that, though. I'm just going to kind of gesture in that direction. And my contribution is going to anticipate some objections that Cohen and other socialists concerned with justice might make towards liberal socialists and try to respond to them. And this is going to draw very deeply on some of the themes that Les was talking about, particularly the importance, I think, of Rawls to any sustainable socialist project in the 21st century. So that, by the way, is the volume that's coming out in a couple of weeks. It was supposed to be here by this point, but as the publishing industry goes, it's been delayed a little bit. But you can probably pre-order it now and actually get 25% off. So still probably be $100. So Cohen was, was born into a working-class Jewish communist family in Montreal, Canada in 1941. Militantly political, his family brought him up in their radical politics. He later attended McGill University in Montreal before moving on to Oxford early on in his career. At Oxford, Cohen was introduced to analytical philosophy, which many people at York, myself once upon a time included, dreaded as the kind of place where interesting thoughts go to die in minutiae. But analytical philosophy, I came around to it under Les's influences, stresses things like rigor and precision over our creative and artistic intuition of the sort that you see in, say, Althusser's work. Cohen famously once said that he had a fondness for Althusser until he weaned himself off of that, right? And personally, I've come around to the idea that that's the right approach to take. Cohen was also deeply influenced by the analytical approach in other ways, in particular stressing the importance of being relentlessly critical, even one's own forebears. Hence where the title No Bullshit Marxism came from, which many people have been deeply offended by. And I should also add that the original title for our collection was going to be No Bullshit Socialism. And I really pushed that very, very heavily until the editor told me, it's not going to happen, get over it, right? There's a swear word in your title. And I kind of was crestfallen and just decided to accept our much more boring title. He passed away in 2009 at the age of 68. And I think that's actually quite a tragedy in some respects, since, of course, the Great Recession broke out almost immediately afterwards. And just generationally, as a millennial who came to York shortly afterwards, I think that had he been alive, he would have had an awful lot to say about the recession, the impact it had on many people, and still does in many respects. Lord only knows what he would have written about Trumpism had he been alive until 2016. One can only speculate. So Cohen's work is often periodized and broken down, but despite its rigor and clarity, it's quite hard to systematize it. Actually, I think that Christine's book is probably the best effort in this respect, right? Kind of laying all the pieces together. And this is because unlike figures like Rawls or Hayek, or for that matter, Nozick, he never published a single big book that ties everything together the way Anarchy, State, and Utopia ties everything together for Nozick, or Theory of Justice and Theory of Justice 2 and Theory of Justice 3, Justice's Fairness Restatement, really does that for Rawls in several different ways. Oftentimes scholars will distinguish between his early Marxist phase, which, depending on when you want to label it, is usually seen as going from 1978 to 1995 or maybe 1991, where you see him defend the Marxist theory of history, refine a new account of exploitation, talk about the importance of people like Hegel to Marx, criticize every other Marxist on it's done. And then there's sometimes what's referred to as his political and moral phase, which runs between 1995 and 2009, where again he abandons what was called the obstetric vision of history, or at least is very critical of it, saying, look, there's no guarantee that socialism is going to arrive. This kind of very orthodox view that we don't need to make moral arguments because the science of history shows that socialism is coming. You can maybe speed it up or slow it down, but that's all you can do. It's just not going to cut it any longer. And so he starts to make arguments for a kind of socialist equality of opportunity, community, freedom, all those other things. And the moral phase is often acclaimed, including by me, because what's really impressive about it is you see Cohen making very deep arguments and entering into very deep dialogues with many figures on the right, most famously Robert Nozick, who he wrote effectively a book-length critique of, but also other figures like essentially Margaret Thatcher, who became something of the villain for a lot of his regular work. I just want to say personally, I myself was really deeply influenced by that, since any of you who know me will know that there's not a Ben Shapiro book out there that I won't pick up and read and review at some point. And I feel very grateful for the opportunity to do that personally. So Cohen evokes several different principles over the course of his career to defend democratic socialism. And this is why he tends to argue that democratic socialism would be a better system than any other, because it embodies and instantiates our respect for moral principles we have reason to care about better than any other. Firstly, Cohen will often argue that democratic socialism would be freer than any other society. And you see him make these arguments, particularly in his, I still think his best essay, the one on money, right? I mean, I think they're just Cohen at his very best. Secondly, Cohen will often say that democratic socialism would be better at securing a deep sense of community and opportunity for all. This is particularly the argument of Why Not Socialism, which, as Christine points out, was released apparently the day of his death. I didn't know that. I am not especially fond of this book, not because I don't care about community. I love community, that's why I came back to York to hold this thing. But yeah, I just don't think this makes the best case for it. And finally, Cohen argues that democratic socialism, surprise, would be more egalitarian than any other alternative system. And in so doing, demonstrate a certain respect for the sacredness of life. All of these principles are important, and if I had a million years, I would talk about my thoughts on his views on all of them, but I'm going to focus on equality here. And the reason is because I think that equality was probably the most important principle for G.A. Cohen, and I think it would be very hard to argue he didn't think it was the most important principle that socialists should be beholden to. Oftentimes, Cohen seems to suggest that equality supports other principles. A more egalitarian society would help secure a principle of community. He also often stresses, like in the paper on freedom and money, that a lack of money contributes to a lack of freedom, so a more equal distribution of resources in some way, shape, or form would help people to be more free. For instance, if you want to travel on a train, and you're not able to do that unless you have money, that's a restriction on your freedom. That's on a par with the Soviet Union, where you had to ask the government's permission to travel. But there's a sense in which equality seems to be the most central to his artwork. And I'm going to argue that I think that in some respects he overemphasizes at least some aspects of egalitarianism over respect for the other principles of justice that socialists might also have reason to cherish. So the main work that I'm going to be looking at is Rescuing Justice and Equality, which is quite an unusual book. What's very unusual because it's kind of divided very cleanly into two. The first half of the book is a very deep, very probing critique of John Rawls. Although it also includes the observation by Cohen himself that he could be characterized as a left Rawlsian, and he wouldn't object to that, which is quite shocking. And then the second half of the book is quite a deep and very interesting meta-ethical analysis that makes the case for the fact independence of norms, that we shouldn't necessarily believe what we do morally because of our adherence to or our respect for certain kinds of social facts, which is an unusual position to take, especially for a Marxist, and I'll get into that in a few seconds. So much of Cohen's work involved, as mentioned, dialoguing at great length with libertarian and liberal thinkers like Nozick and Ronald Dworkin, arguing for a more egalitarian approach to justice. But perhaps his most extensive and complicated dialogue was with John Rawls, kind of his ultimate frenemy, if you were, who he responds to in many, many different places. In 2008's Rescuing Justice and Equality, again, he argues that he wouldn't object to being called a left-wing Rawlsian, and makes the very un-Marxist claim that our approach to justice should be trans-historical and disregard social circumstances to a certain extent. And since Rawls himself notably aligned with a tradition that he called liberal socialism or property-owning democracy, at least by the time of his last book, Justice, Fairness, and Restatement, I think it's worth thinking about what liberal socialists would say in response to Cohen and his objections to this very particular Rawlsian outlook. This is a very long, very complicated book, hundreds of pages, right? So I'm just going to be able to give you a sense of the flavor of it here, a little taste, as it were. So Cohen had enormous respect for Rawls, right? There's just really no doubt about it. And he often makes clear his enormous theoretical debts to him, particularly in the late Moore period. However, in Rescuing Justice and Equality, he takes issue with Rawls for not being sufficiently committed to egalitarian justice, revisiting themes from his series of lectures and papers, If You're an Egalitarian, Why You're So Rich, amongst others. Summarizing all of Cohen's objections in this very long book would take a lot of time, so I'm just going to focus on two. So firstly, Cohen takes serious issue with the fact that Rawls says we need to be sensitive to incentives when conceptualizing an egalitarian society governed by something like Rawls's famous difference principle. Now, there are a lot of valences to this, but long story short, many of you might know that Rawls argues that inequalities can be justified, even in a liberal socialist society, so long as they are to the benefit of the least well-off, and only the least well-off. And this is often taken as an argument for the need to retain certain incentive structures to inspire people to become doctors or lawyers if that's the benefit of the least well-off, because otherwise people aren't going to bother going to law school or med school because they're just not going to think they're going to get a big reward or chunk of money at the end of this. And Cohen memorably compares this in the book to a kidnapper who calls the parents of the person they've kidnapped and says the parents have a moral obligation to pay him money, or their child will suffer. The problem with this is that the kidnapper absolves himself of any duty to not profit from his initially immoral acts and places the responsibility solely on the parents to kind of rectify the immorality that's taken place. Similarly, Cohen says, someone who claims they will not work for the benefit of others unless they are incentivized to do so, or incentivized to kind of help induce the structures that are needed for egalitarian society, can't be said to care very much about egalitarian justice. In this respect, and Cohen doesn't like to use this term, but I will, he seems to think that Rawls's difference principle is too disindividuated, right? It removes from us the responsibility to be committed to egalitarian justice as individual persons, right? That leads to the second objection. So Cohen rejects the idea that the principles of justice should be applied only to what Rawls calls the basic structure of society, rather than govern individual behavior. Notably, Rawls famously says, especially in his lectures on political philosophy, that this is an idea he takes from Marx and Hegel, that the principles of justice are to govern the basic structure rather than individual behavior the way other liberals argue. So Rawls famously argues that the principles of justice should only govern the basic structure while leaving individuals largely free to pursue their own comprehensive visions of the good life. This is quite complicated in Rawlsian theory. If you really want to be bored, we can talk about the Aristotelian principle and all that, but this is the generic view that people take. Cohen noticed that Rawls occasionally wobbles on this claim, especially when he's under pressure from feminist critics who argue for an extension of the principles of justice into the family, following the famous feminist dictum that the personal is the political, which personally I have a lot of sympathy with, right? So Cohen thinks that Rawls was right to wobble on this point, since any morally sensible, and for that matter morally sensitive person, would recognize that we have reason to care about outcomes in the personal areas of our life, in addition to to justice in political and economic structures. So I think that these are really powerful and very thoughtful objections. And again, one of the things that I really admire about Cohen, in addition to being a pretty funny guy, is the fact that he had this really pronounced ethical seriousness to him. That as a continuously lapsing Catholic, I just happen to find very resonant, right? We were talking about this just
It's not
last
just
week.
one and done. You keep lapsing.
Yeah, that's exactly that. Well, that's a very Catholic thing to do also, right? You gotta pray to the God, okay? So Cohen's objections to Rawls are powerful and thought-provoking to anybody who cares about egalitarian justice, which I'm guessing most of us in the room do. Nonetheless, I think that a liberal socialist like Rawls, or myself, or any of you who might be wobbling on converting, we can respond to him, okay? While still arguing for a radically egalitarian outlook, without imposing such severe ethical burdens on individuals. So firstly, I argue it's important to note that Rawls claims in the lectures on moral philosophy to have taken the concern with the basic structure from Hegel and later from Marx. And there's a deep sense, therefore, in which Rawls is not a methodological individualist, but a methodological collectivist, right? He's really committed to this idea that we are social animals, and consequently that we need to take seriously the society in which we live. Given how Marx himself follows Hegel on these concerns, I think that there's a really strange sense in which Rawls is being more Marxist on this point than Cohen himself, because Rawls says the basic structure is what we should be concerned with, social reality is what we should be concerned with, rather than individual moral behavior. So this is Rawls' statement about his own philosophy in his last important work, Justice's Fairness Restatement. Welfare state capitalism also rejects the fair value of the political liberties, and while there is some concern for equality of opportunity, the policies necessary to achieve that are not followed. It permits very large inequalities in the ownership of real property, by which it means productive assets and natural resources, so that the control of the economy and much of political life rests in a few hands. And although, as the name welfare state capitalism suggests, welfare provisions may be quite generous and guarantee a decent social minimum covering the basic needs, a principle of reciprocity to regulate economic and social inequalities is not recognized. This leaves what Rawls calls property-owning democracy and liberal socialism. Their ideal descriptions include arrangements designed to satisfy the two principles of justice. So those are the kind of regimes Rawls comes down on in the end, in his typical, very evocative and poetic prose, right, that everybody has just come to love. So my claim is that this kind of objection that Rawls is actually in some ways more Marxist than Cohen shouldn't concern us all that much, since if you're a good analytical Marxist, you should probably say, well, so much the worse for Marxist dogma then. If Marx is wrong about that, then we should just say, not to hell with Marx, but at least he was wrong about that. But it is an odd thing for Cohen to say, given that as late as the 2000s, he was still defending versions of the Marxist theory of history. Right? He released a new book version of Karl Marx's theory of history defense, and he never really seemed to have given up at least a certain fixation, or fascination at least, with historical materialism. The more important objection I want to make, though, relates back to liberty and the importance of the principle of liberty. Rawls, Dworkin, and other liberal egalitarians emphasize how, at least on their theory, liberty and equality support one another as basic principles. Although, as Les taught me again and again, Dworkin, I think quite rightly, used to say that it's a good thing liberty and equality don't conflict, because if they did, equality would win all the time, right? According to Dworkin, and I think that Rawls carries a similar intuition in his work, we are committed to equality because of our commitment that each life is sacred. It's important that everyone's life, regardless of circumstances, go well. And this leads in very clearly to a commitment to liberty, because as Dworkin would say, we have a special responsibility to ensure our own lives go well, that no one else can assume for us, right? It is important to us that our life goes well. No one else can live our life for us. And I think this is why Rawls places such an important emphasis on the importance of the basic liberties in his system, and why somebody like Dworkin emphasizes the importance of fundamental rights that need to be guaranteed even to unpopular minorities, right? One of Dworkin's most powerful points is that democracy can become inherently anti-egalitarian if large majorities want to persecute minority groups. So I think that the personalized moral view that Cohen defends is so demanding of individuals because it requires that they subordinate even their private activities to the pursuit of egalitarian justice, and this disturbs the balance between liberty and equality that I think is better struck by people like Rawls and, for that matter, by Dworkin, at least in some of Dworkin's work. It requires so much of individuals, potentially right down, Cohen flirts with the idea of requiring individuals to not be as selective as they might want about what jobs they're going to work, or what levels of compensation they're willing to take for the work that they do, and to still retain this deep commitment to equality. And while Cohen never argues that people should be coerced into doing something that they wouldn't want to, there's undoubtedly something Spartan and, I would say, unfree about this kind of highly moralistic version of socialism. Although I don't know if I'd go as far as Christine in calling it almost quasi-Stalinist, right? But sometimes. So given Cohen's own commitment to a pluralistic set of principles, it's unclear to me why we would want to take such a maximalist approach to equality, when there are other things that socialists have reason to value, like freedom and community. I think that liberal socialism, a la Rawls or Dworkin, does a better job at striking the right balance between liberty and equality by ensuring that we have a basic structure that provides for everybody's needs through a rough equality of property, while still not making great personal demands of individuals in their individual life, where I think most of us already feel overburdened enough already. So that's my presentation.
While I'm waiting for this, let me just say, this was like really fascinating for me to hear the initial talks, and of course, there's really provocative contributions. There's so much there that I want to argue with, or ask about, or interact with. But I will be good and save almost all of that for the Q&A. I do just want to note two things. One of them is, if it's not obvious from the presentations, it certainly won't be obvious from mine because I focus elsewhere. I think there's a really interesting range of views here about Cohen's luck egalitarianism, what he calls in Why Not Socialism, his socialist equality of opportunity principle, because Christine, and I think in his own way Les, both think that it's insufficiently egalitarian. And Matt, I believe, is a right deviationist on this, right? I think he's going to be on Rawls' side of this, and he thinks it's actually too demandingly egalitarian. Whereas I sit here alone in the sensible center, thinking that Cohen was just right about like egalitarianism. So I'm sure we can get into that in the Q&A. The second thing is that Les's comment about Cohen's humor and his impressions always reminds me of back in 2019 showing the late great socialist podcaster Michael Brooks a video of Cohen doing an impression of Gilbert Ryle, which is very mean but very funny, and Michael telling me that that watching it made him a little mad because he really wanted to book Cohen on the show now. It was a terrible shame that they could no longer do this. But the main thing that I was grappling with in my paper in the book is not, the content of the moral theory for the most part, right? It was a one-way. But for the most part, it wasn't the content of the moral theory, luck egalitarianism or otherwise, but it was the relationship between that normative case for socialism and Cohen's analytical reconstruction and defense of historical materialism. There's a narrative about the trajectory of his career that I think we heard again. I think there were some competing claims, and if you kind of parse it all in the earlier presentations, but it's very, very common. I think anybody who's taken an interest in Cohen's work has heard some version of this narrative before that says there are two phases of his career. You have early materialist Cohen, who's starting with the publication of Karl Marx's Theory of History in 1978, who's interested in defending a relatively orthodox Marxist account of historical materialism, and then you have later normative Cohen. And they, again, you hear versions of this from Cohen's, friends and admirers, and you certainly hear it from critics of him. From both, on the one hand, critics of Cohen from within Marxism, and on the other hand, of course, anti-Marxists. And the version of the story that you tend to hear in both cases, like where the anti-Marxists and the Marxist anti-Cohenites converge, is that they'll say, okay, Cohen started out trying to combine real hardcore Marxism with the methodology of analytic philosophy. And at some point that project ran into trouble or ran out of gas, so he was then forced to switch to doing moral philosophy. Having given up on the capital L, capital H laws of history, he settled for making arguments about the desirability of socialism. And whereas I wouldn't go so far as to deny that there are any elements of truth to that, I think that there are places certainly where you can see him in his late work caveating certain claims, backing off of certain kind of inevitability claims, etc. My position, certainly in the paper, is that there was, he left us with plenty of gas in the tank of an analytical reconstruction and defense of historical materialism. As Matt said, as recently as 2000 edition of Karl Marx's Theory of History, he's introducing various second thoughts and caveats, but there's not really a sweeping abandonment of the core claims. And I would certainly point to this book, Reconstructing Marxism by Eric Wright, Andrew Levine, and Elliot Sober, from the 1990s, which I think is the first part of it is a sophisticated defense of a version of historical materialism that's inspired by, although it tweaks in certain ways, Cohen's formulations in the late 70s. And it seems to me that this is still the state of the art. I think that sadly, we just don't have enough analytic philosophers in the 2020s who are interested in historical materialism that we have either something better than this or a particularly compelling critique of it right now. But I think that if you want to pick this up, I think you just kind of have to thaw out reconstructive Marxism and start from there.
Shameless plug to all the grad students in the room.
No, seriously, do this. I would be so happy, right? Read some dissertations about
And
this.
certainly if you combine it with Eric Wright's classes.
Oh yeah, no, absolutely, yeah. And he actually has really interesting things to say in classes about the elements of historical materialism that that he'd still defend. So, but this idea that, okay, first Cohen was interested in defending relatively orthodox historical materialism, and then he gave that up, or realized it was fruitless and abandoned it, and he was just doing moral philosophy. One anti-Marxist version of this comes from Canada's own Joseph Heath, who wrote a widely circulated essay a couple of years ago called John Rawls and the Death of Western Marxism. And the story that Heath tells is that starting with the publication of Karl Marx's Theory of History in 1978, there was this tremendous upsurge of academic interest in renewing and clarifying Marxism. And you had all of these no bullshit analytical Marxists who were doing what Heath describes as some of the most intellectually interesting work out there. But somewhere along the line, it all ran out of steam, and Rawlsian liberalism just sort of absorbed it all like a philosophical Borg. Obviously, Cohen, very famously had deep disagreements with Rawls. We just heard about some of them. But in Heath's story, these are just details. The important thing is that Cohen and the rest of the analytical Marxist crew started out being interested in exploitation, which is a properly Marxist concept. And trying to make sense of that was a bit of a conceptual mess. And then in Heath's telling, they realized over time that exploitation didn't really matter. What really mattered was inequality, which Heath frames as a fundamentally liberal concern that's alien to Marxism. And one of the things that was interesting to me when Heath's essay came out is that when it was making the rounds, I noticed, okay, Heath is an anti-Marxist liberal, but his essay was being shared with equal enthusiasm by people who agreed with him and by people who thought of themselves as very orthodox Marxists and were kind of taking this as a morality tale about how analytical Marxism, and its many deviations, from the truth, of the original stone tablets of Marxism will lead you back to anti-Marxist liberalism in the end, inevitably, right? And liberals like Heath, there's some conservatives and libertarians I saw sharing the essay back then, basically think, okay, Cohen started out in Karl Marx's theory of history trying to do no bullshit Marxism, and then he came to realize that when you took out the bullshit, there was nothing left, right? It was bullshit all the way down. And whereas the story told by orthodox Marxist critics of Cohen might go something like this, or this is one version of it. The heart of Marxism is the dialectical method, so there's a famous quote from Leon Trotsky about how Marxism without the dialectic is like a clock without a spring. And in dismissing that method in terms of the methodologies of analytic philosophy and the bourgeois social sciences, it was inevitable that you'd end up in fundamentally bourgeois liberal conclusions. And in some versions of the story, they'll really key into places where Cohen uses the word Platonism and rescuing justice and equality, and say, look, what is this trans-historical concept of justice? I mean, this is just so anti-Marxist, right? This so contrary to the historical materialism that he started out trying to defend. And what I argue in the paper is that both versions of the story are just fundamentally wrong for several reasons. And in the time I have left, I'm going to mention a few of those reasons, sort of run through some of those reasons, and then at least gesture in the direction of the positive project of the paper, which is trying to supplement Cohen's picture of history and justice and how the two interact, and to sort of try to show that there is, even if he was correct about all the things I think he was correct about, that there was something important that was missing there. So the first reason I think the story is misguided is maybe the least interesting, although I think it's also pretty decisive as to the actual claim about the trajectory of Cohen's career. And that is that the chronology doesn't work. So if you read, for example, Nozick's big paper about Will Chamberlain, that was published in 1977. And all of the major elements of his moral case for socialism, all the major elements of the case for socialism you get in Why Not Socialism, published on the occasion of his death, right? So at the very possible last moment of his career, are basically all there in that 1977 paper. He's already talking about equality as the most important socialist value. He's already saying, right, in footnote 8, that justice just is equality. And so to the extent that equality has to give way to other values, we're trying to figure out how the institutions of a socialist society should work, we should think of that as accepting a certain amount of injustice because of other values. He's already talking about one of those other values being a principle of community, right? It's all there in 1977, which is a year before Karl Marx's theory of history came out. I'm not sure when he wrote the original draft of the paper, but it is interesting, in fact, that not only is it before Karl Marx's theory of history came out, but there is a footnote that refers to it as a forthcoming book under a different name, right? Philosophical Defense of Karl Marx's Theory of History. right? And it seems to me that yes, there are details that change. There are certainly things that he elaborates on. There's certainly theoretical, developments in how he's thinking about equality and so on. But it seems to me that the major elements of the supposedly post-historical materialist phase of Cohen's career were already there before the book that where he announced his big defense of historical materialism. And a related point is that I think that it shouldn't be surprising to read Cohen emphasize inequality in 1978, because the idea that equality is somehow an un-Marxist concern, I think would have been very surprising to Karl Marx. An argument that Marx makes in a few different places is, essentially that one reason why we should care about exploitation, one reason why we should be concerned about exploitation, is that exploitation is a mechanism for producing so much material equality. Inequality, right? That we have, this is the argument at the end of the first section of the Critique of the Goethe program, that this sort of, outrageous distribution of the means of consumption that you get under capitalism is downstream of the distribution of the means of production. In Capital, there are a couple of points where Marx is talking about scenarios where the poverty of the working class might decrease at the same time as capital continues to skyrocket in accumulation. And every time he touches on such a scenario, a point that Marx always pauses to make is, but that doesn't matter because the relative poverty of the working class is still increasing. Because if workers are becoming less poor at a slower rate than the capitalists are becoming more rich, then what Marx just seems to take it for granted that we should care the most about, which is their relative poverty, is increasing. So even though the location of the floor might be of considerable interest, right? Marx just takes it for granted that we'll care about how big the gap is between the floor and the ceiling in actual material distribution of the means of consumption. People who insist that Marx is dismissive about equality often quote mine in what I think are really misleading ways from that discussion in Critique of the Goethe program, where he argues strenuously against the Lassallean slogan about equally rewarding the fruits of workers' labor, right? That workers would all get the same rewards materially. But if you pay attention to the actual argument Marx is making there, Marx is bringing up exactly the kinds of considerations that would inform the equality of what debates about among different kinds of egalitarian philosophers in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, right? I want to be clear, I'm not attributing luck egalitarianism or any other particular sophisticated moral theory to Karl Marx. That would be anachronistic, and in any case, Marx was certainly not a moral philosopher, by any stretch of the imagination. Right? In fact, in some of Marx's early writings, he's a bit dismissive of moral philosophy as an enterprise, and even putting that aside, I think he was too busy, theorizing about historical change and formulating his history-changing critique of political economy to do moral philosophy. But I also think he would have been a hell of a moral philosopher if he had done that. And again, you have these, he's anticipating the kinds of things that you see in all these 20th century equality of what papers, like pointing out that equality in the distribution of material resources, is unfair insofar as different people have different needs, right? You find him pointing out that if we equally distribute in proportion to the duration or intensity of labor contributions, this will be a problem because people have different innate talents, which is precisely one of the lines of thought that later leads to luck egalitarianism, so not everybody is able to make identical labor contributions. And Marx also anticipates in this discussion a line of thought about how the things that are objectionable about tying reward to labor contributions, the ways in which, not that Marx would like this way of putting it, but the ways in which that is unjust, have to be swallowed for the sake of economic development in the lower phase of a communist society. That looks to me like a proto version of the same line, the same line of thought that in one form becomes Rawls's difference principle, and in a different form, right, making different conceptual moves, becomes Cohen's picture, whereby socialist equality of opportunity is always our North Star, we get to as close as we can to, but also in any given phase of history, the trade-offs between different values might mean that you justly accept a certain amount of injustice. People will often quote Marx's line here about how right can't move higher than the material conditions of society, and take that as Marx endorsing a kind of historical relativism about justice in distribution. But as Cohen points out in his brilliant essay about Isaiah Berlin and Marx and him, a plain reading of the meaning of that passage would be precisely the opposite. Because after all, how can we talk about how far right has come along? How can we talk about a lower phase and a higher phase of communism if we don't have a transhistorical yardstick by which to measure which one is lower and which one is higher? And that brings me to one more reason why many critics assume that this conflict between Cohenian moral philosophy and Marxist historical materialism, which is that they assume that historical materialism entails that all ideas in everyone's heads about equality, morality, or anything else are superstructural. But on, it seems to me that, one, this is a more controversial claim, but just to throw my own marker down, I don't think Marx thought that, right? I don't think that's a plausible reading of Marx himself, right? In the passages in 1859 that are often taken to support that claim, I think that that's kind of an extreme reading of the text. But two, whatever Marx may or may not have thought, that's certainly not something that Cohen ever believed. If you read Karl Marx's Theory of History, he explicitly disowns that claim, right? First edition, right? He explicitly says, no, I'm not defending the claim that every single, philosophical or moral idea in everybody's head is superstructural. The kind of base superstructure analysis that Cohen endorses in that book is about the legal and political superstructure of a society, and he's very cautious about extending it beyond that. Okay, so everything I've said in the bulk of this presentation has been defensive, but I do want to spend the last minute or two of this at least gesturing in what I hope will be an interestingly suggestive way at the positive contribution, where I think Cohen's picture can be improved on. So historical materialism, in my view, gives us a very powerful, and I still think a very compelling, picture of how historical change happens on the fact side of the fact-value distinction. But on the value side, we can ask whether what we're looking at is historical progress and how satisfied we should be with that progress. And we can ask questions like, to go back to that discussion in Eric Olwright's classes, we can ask questions about whether there's any sense in which the dynamics of historical change itself, the expansion of the productive forces of society, are going to progressively lead to the realization of higher values in our form of social organization. And one way of thinking about what Cohen is doing, and Matt alluded to this in his presentation, is that you can think of Cohen, even though people usually don't, but I think perhaps you should, as being in the tradition of the kind of way of thinking about socialism that thinks of socialism as a higher or deeper, fulfillment of the values of the bourgeois revolutions. And so, for example, Cohen has his socialist equality of opportunity principle, which, as Les mentioned, is explicitly framed as a deeper notion of equality than bourgeois equality of opportunity. The ideal that the actual French revolutionaries had in mind, or even left liberal equality of opportunity. This is we've sort of like really gone to the nub of like what kind of equality we should care about. So that's your egalite, and he's got his community principle, which would be your fraternité. But I think there is a Liberté-sized hole in Cohen's normative case for socialism. That Cohen is not oblivious to the value of freedom. He'll often bring it up as a limitation, right, on what he's suggesting, right, that there are ways that the extent to which we can pursue egalitarian justice is limited by the importance of freedom, right, so he'll sort of acknowledge it in that way, right, that there are things that we could do that would make justice more egalitarian, but we shouldn't do because that would involve unacceptable sacrifices to freedom. He'll do that. He'll bring up freedom in the context of defending particular historical Marxist arguments, as in the Structure of Proletarian on Freedom paper. He'll bring up freedom when he feels like there's a chance to turn the tables on capitalist apologists and say, actually, you guys are the ones who are committed to freedom, which is essentially what he's doing in that Freedom and Money paper that Matt was praising. But what you don't really see Cohen doing is foregrounding freedom in his positive moral case for socialism. This is not one of the values that he references in Why Not Socialism, for example. And I think that's a mistake. And I think it's a mistake certainly for political reasons, that the case for socialism is much more compelling, particularly in very freedom-obsessed societies, if it is grounded there. And I think it's a mistake as a matter of principle. And I think that there is room there, I think, to hook up Cohen's picture with the kind of work that's been done in the last several years by Marxist scholars who want to sort of rediscover the importance of Republican notions of freedom in Marx. Think here about William Clay Roberts and Marx's Inferno, or I think a better version, and Bruno Leipold, Citizen Marx, from more recently. And I think that there you could do the same move that Cohen wants to make with his other values. That you say, oh, here's this deeper form of the same value that the original bourgeois revolutionaries cared about. That you need proletarian revolution, or perhaps a gradualist version of proletarian revolution to fulfill. I know that is a promissory note, much more than a worked out argument. But on that note, I think I will stop talking and let's go to discussion. Well, I don't think so. I think that, this is where I want to be careful, because I think that they're, like, going back to Christine's talk, right? I think that even if I'm right, that Cohen, the moral philosopher, and Cohen, the historical materialist, aren't in tension in the way that a lot of people think they are. That doesn't mean that there aren't respects in which he backs off of some of his earlier claims. I think certainly some of the inevitabilism, right, his later critique of the obstetric view that the new society is waiting to be born. We just have to, it's just a question of how long it'll take. But I think depending on what you mean by scientific, I think that if you mean empirical, we're making factual claims, right? I do think that even the sort of, maybe relatively weak form of historical materialism that he's defending, in like the 2000 edition of Karl Marx's Theory of History, I think he does still see himself as, as defending factual claims.
I would put it a somewhat different way. In Charles Taylor's lecture on Karl Marx for Brian McGee's program, Taylor emphasizes that one of the appeals of Marxism to many thinking people has been its ability to reconcile a kind of teleological and religious sensibility with kind of scientific pretensions, if you want to put it that way, of the Enlightenment. And give many people the thought that they're not only being rigorous scientific realists, but have a vision for the future that's about to come. I have never been particularly attracted to the versions of Marxism that do emphasize this importance of vision. And I don't think, certainly by the end of his career, Taylor was either. Cohen was either. I think he makes it very clear that any version of historical materialism is going to have to be less ambitious than some of the sweeping versions of it that you saw early on in the more confident phases of Marxism's history. And that does not mean it cannot be a generative program. If anything, I think he thinks it could be a more generative program and in a productive sense. It just means that if you're going to look to historical materialism to be an explanation or a theory of everything, at least when it comes to society, then you're going to be deeply disappointed by his work, but he'd say that's probably because you're going to be deeply disappointed by what Marxism is actually able to do.
I mean, there's a line I don't remember if it's in the first edition or not, or if it's just something he had in the 2000 edition. But there's a line in Karl Marx's Theory of History where he says that it's like a theory of all of history would just sort of innately be implausible, right? Like that's real human history is obviously too messy and multi-causal for that. But it doesn't necessarily follow that there's none of history that you can have this kind of theory of. And so in a very frustrating but funny Cohen kind of way, he says that the amount of history he's trying to explain is somewhere in between none of it and all of it.
Yeah. If you're looking at historical materialism to explain why Alex Jones is saying what he's doing right now, then you're not going to be very satisfied about it.
Cohen did say he was interested in what to think, not what to do. And I think he thought there was a division of labor between activists and intellectuals. He thought that was inevitable, that to think about these really vexing ethical questions in a rigorous, careful way required, education, required the time to do it. So it's in the service of emancipation, but it does involve a specialized class doing that work. And frankly, I don't think we should overstate the populism of communist movements. What about the vanguard of Lenin's idea of the vanguard, and the idea of and the kind of dogmatism of a lot of in the history of communist politics, which is certainly thought that some are holding the right views and the others are not, and often with very pernicious consequences. So, at the same time, Cohen was involved in some ordinary political activities. He campaigned for Labour candidates, and he did try to act in an ethical way. He also gave some really terrific popular defenses of socialist ideas in the British radio and television. There's a terrific discussion of the shmoo. I don't know if you've seen that.
I've seen it.
Yeah. So he thought that was an important work, but it wasn't the only work that needed to be done. So, I mean, it's not. I mean, is Rawls okay? I mean, that's hardly a theory of justice by John Rawls is hardly accessible to the working class either. I mean, I think it's probably just the nature of philosophical expertise.
Cohen did feel like his background enabled him to have a level of authenticity around his academic work that mattered. So he felt for sure connected to the working class, however he understood it, in a very sort of tangible, but that's a sort of psychology underlying what he's thinking. I do think that this isn't exactly what Christine's saying, but kind of what Christine's saying. He did have a capacity to pull out and using what he would describe as sort of tools of analytical Marxism to think critically about a lot of popular culture things. So one of his sort of well-known examples was around the red hen and the idea of the sort of Thatcher idea of sort of saying, well, people should have to contribute and work in order to, and the problem with welfare states is people were being rewarded for lack of effort. And he very much said, this is a funny narrative because when I was growing up in the 1940s and 50s, that story was a story for Marxism. There was a kind of capability, but I mean it's pretty undeniable that he lived a pretty privileged existence, I guess. Maybe Ben, this is sort of a bit of a comment to you about one thing that Cohen did say, sort of, I mean, he would say that in lots of respects, the catalyst for Karl Marx's theory of history was Plamenas's Man and Society critique of Marxism. But he would also say that when he was teaching at UCL for basically 20 years, he was actually teaching pretty conventional moral political philosophy. And he was at the, we'd have a discussion, or he'd read something that I had sent him as a graduate student. The next thing I know, he'd send me these 10 pages of notes on a particular issue between, the significance of prima facie duties that he had written for, his. So there's a sense in which he was already well immersed. It wasn't like he came to that field,
right?
And to a certain extent, the part of the reasonable reading about his Will Chamberlain and Nozick paper was that he went to Princeton for that sabbatical and got introduced to Nozick's work and was like, wow, this is actually kind of a bridge between my sort of market, and that's so. Anyhow, I'm sure you probably know that, but I'm just sort of saying that's another aspect, or I've never read Heath's paper, but there is an aspect of that story that doesn't seem consistent.
That doesn't. Sorry, I'm not sure I followed the last move.
So your point that it was already there
in the
70s, and I'm sort of saying that that's for sure probably true if you had a broader sense. I don't know whether his lecture notes were ever made public. Has anybody? This is There's I just don't know the answer. Did his papers ever go anywhere?
I looked through his papers when I wrote my book. I went to his daughter's house and looked through this old rusty filing cabinet full of stuff. Yeah.
Right.
But the only thing that's happened is that Michael Otsuka and Joe Wolf put together those posthumous collections.
Yeah.
Going through a lot of stuff.
Well,
there is one book about his lectures, right? That Joe Wolf did, but they're on classical thinkers. That's the third.
Oh, right. The history of
The first point is defensive, but then like the second one is, I hope going to recognize the sort of reasonable core of the question, right? Like, so the defensive point is I do think, and I do think that it matters what we're contrasting analytical Marxism to, right? Mm-hmm. So are we contrasting analytical Marxism to Marxist pamphlets that are written by non-academics, right? Like as like educational materials for like a socialist organization? Because if so, yeah, sure, I totally get the critique, right? But of course, that's not really a critique of analytical Marxism. That's a critique of academic Marxism in general. Mm-hmm. If we're contrasting analytical Marxism to non-analytical academic Marxism, the latter is billions of times less accessible to non-academic readers, right? I mean, you can basically, like an undergraduate or non-academic, right? Can being exposed to this for the first time, can basically pick up quite a bit of like Cohen's writing or Eric Olin Wright's writing, and you might see some technical terminology, maybe you'll have a few things to be explained, but like by and large, these are guys who put tremendous value and emphasis on clarity and exposition. And in fact, a lot of what they were reacting to, a lot of what in their more intemperate moments they were calling bullshit, was precisely the abject failure of other kinds of academic Marxism to put that emphasis on clarity. I remember it's on video, so I'm not going to name the conference, but I was at a conference with much Marxist material. Matt was there too. I think he may know what I'm talking about.
Oh, I do.
In late, year and a half or so ago. And I remember looking through the conference program. I believe there was a paper called "Abstract Labor is a Phallus," and I remember thinking, okay, if analytical Marxism is non-bullshit Marxism, this is the other kind. So I think that in fact that kind of clarity, right? That in Cohen's case, he's getting from analytic philosophy. In other analytical Marxists who come from different academic backgrounds, they're getting from other places. I think there is something that's very anti-elitist about it, right? That this is in principle accessible to everybody. Now, I don't want to overstate this, and this is where I do want to recognize the obvious core of truth in the complaint, which is that even if it's relatively accessible, because it's written very, very clearly with a great emphasis on the importance of clarity, certainly look, if you read like Cohen's, papers from, the 90s and 2000s where he's really worried about the finer details of like egalitarianism and the, exactly how we should think about expensive tastes, right? This is something that, there is a level there is a level of the deepness of the dive in going back and back and back to the same very, very fine-grained distinctions that nobody but an academic could love, right?
Finding out that expensive taste will ride again, right?
Oh my God, yeah. They have as a lifelong academic, I am sometimes frustrated by it, and it's like, yeah, this is definitely for academics, right? There is an amount of time being spent in certain cases, not everything he wrote, but in certain cases there is an amount of time being spent on very, very fine-grained questions that, non-academics are generally going to have less time for. I think that much is true. But I think that's not a reason to reject the insights themselves, right? I think that's maybe, and this is just going back to Christine's original point, right? I think that's maybe a reason to think there's a division of labor, right? Quite a bit of what I've tried to do, for Jacobin, right, in the last few years, I've written several things about Cohen's work for Jacobin, is to try to be on the other end of that division of labor and see how we can translate this into a more popularized form, right? Because if you think that there is valuable insight there, right, you want to convey it in a form that's going to be more accessible for people who don't want to spend quite this much time on the details of some of these topics. But I don't think that means that there's no real contribution that's being made by people who do have the patience to spend that much time working out the details. I think it's a legitimate division of labor ultimately. That would be my take.
Yeah, I was just going to say one more thing about this, pretty much echoing what you said. I always do think it's funny when other academic Marxists say your academic Marxism isn't connected to the working class. Because my response to that is usually say, I completely agree, but neither is yours, right? I have never known a single person that I've worked with at any blue-collar job I've worked at who gives a shit about what Althusser has to say about anything, or would pick up reading Capital and understand a word of it, right? The same is true of Gayatri Spivak, the same is true of you pick, right? So one of the things that I think is valuable about analytical Marxism is most of what you described, right? The emphasis on clarity, I think, is extremely important, because I think that there's a certain level of respect that you show to people by trying to be clear about what you're arguing for and not obscuring it under these layers of philosophical erudition and kind of speculative intuition, right? The one thing that I would say about analytical Marxism that I do think is elitist is precisely this tendency to overindulge in emphasizing the importance of these really pedantic debates that personally I just don't care very much about, right? I could not care less about them. Some people do, and I think that's very important, but I don't. And that's because I think that what we should be doing more as radical intellectuals is trying to reach out to ordinary people, using these tools and this emphasis on clarity to try to make our case for democratic socialism, and then hopefully convince enough people to actually form a movement that can do something about that. And I'm also willing to think that there are other versions of academic Marxism that can do that as well. But I think that what they need to learn from what we do is to try to be a lot clearer in their exposition and show people that level of respect. So I think we have time for one more question. I have two things that I'd like to say about that one. The first is that I personally agree with you, right? And Ben and I have had debates about this. I'm a lot more sympathetic to the importance of dialectics, particularly a left Hegelian dialectic, in understanding Marxism. I also think that there are theoretical resources in analytic philosophy today that make a conciliation between analytical approaches and a kind of Hegelian approach to Marxism a lot more easy, right? A very good example of this would be the tremendous surge of academic Hegelianism out there. If you think about the work of people like Robert Brandon, for example, right, who I think provides a lot of tools to make such a conciliation. What does Cohen specifically offer? I think that what Cohen and analytical Marxists historically have done far better than most people who emphasize this dialectic, continentally inflected version of Marxism is the ability to make very straightforward moral arguments for the superiority of democratic socialism, other over-competing theoretical traditions, right? I can tell you very straightforwardly why it is that Cohen thinks that democratic socialism would be a more equal society, why Cohen thinks democratic socialism would be a more free society, although there are problems there, and why democratic socialism would do a better job at fostering the ideal of community. And beyond that, I can also tell you why Cohen thinks all those things are important for us to cherish, right? It's just very hard to develop ethical and moral arguments with the same level of immediate punch coming from that competing tradition. That's not possible, and people like Charles Taylor, I think, do a really good job with that, but it's more difficult, right? And so if there was something that I think continentally trained or oriented Marxists could take away from it, it would be the importance of, again, making those kinds of arguments. Which leads back to my first point, actually, that I just made. I think that this is also vital when trying to reach out to working class or other marginalized kinds of individuals who almost always understand their situation in an ethically loaded way.
We have spent a lot of the last few years teaching classes on capital, and spent a lot of time reading it and rereading it, and we do have a disagreement, you and I, about whether there's like a tremendous amount of dialectical methodology in there. Certainly, there are precious few explicit references. You have if you're reading like the Penguin edition, which translates the fourth German edition, you have the phrase dialectical inversion, I believe, twice over the course of those 940 pages, 80 pages, right? And also, I think Ingalls put both of those in. I think because if you read the Princeton translation, it's translation of
your beloved translation,
second German edition. I'm not a fan, but is interested on this point that the word dialectical doesn't appear once in the main text, right? And that's translating the second German edition, which is the last German edition that Marx signs off on. I suppose it's possible that he put in those two instances of dialectical inversion for the French edition before he died, but I don't know. But also I think Michael Heinrich, who's written a lot about capital, and in my experience is very popular among people who are very dismissive of analytical Marxism. Does converge with the analytical Marxists on this. There's this wonderful passage in the introduction to his book, How to Read Marxist Capital, where he says this is the place where a lot of people would put in a passage on the dialectical method, but all anybody seems to say in those sections of their books is that everything is connected to everything else, and it's all terribly complicated. Which I don't actually find that methodologically informative, right? True, right? I can't disagree that things are connected to other things and it is all very complicated, but I don't think it's that methodologically informative. I think that I think that there are certain things that are associated with dialectics talk in Hegel and Marx that I think you can reconstruct in ways that they make sense, like the word contradiction is used in a dialectical way. We can sort of break apart, okay, what are different things you might be using the word contradiction to use? You could have a system that has multiple conditions for being realized that are pushing in opposite directions. That's all fine, but that's not one, that doesn't add up to a method for finding the truth that's different from any method used by anybody else. Seems to me that Marx throughout Capital is just making very straightforward arguments. He's appealing to empirical evidence all the time, the factory inspectors reports and all that stuff. And he's making normal arguments in normal ways. I don't see a distinct method there. And I think that he has, and it's also just, I think to the extent that using a dialectical idiom, right, can lead you to certain insights. I don't even deny that, right? That this is, if you're sort of attuned to noticing ways that things are in flux, you're attuned to noticing contradictions in the dialectical way of using the word contradiction. That's all fine. But I think if it's true, you should be able to translate it out of dialectics talk and into the ordinary language of causes and effects and mechanisms, which is where, for example, right, Levine and Sober land and their discussion of dialectics in reconstructing Marxism, right? So, all of which is just to say, at least from my perspective, I would just try to earnestly argue with the continental Marxists that they were misguided.
Have you considered that you're that being for whom being is a question to your being, right? I think it's very important for you to contemplate that. Right? I think that we're out of time, but like I mentioned, if you want, we're going to Popper's Pub. Feel free to come and argue with Ben about that, right? There's nothing I know that he loves more than continental philosophers getting in England. It's just what he lives for. So we'll see you all there, and I hope you enjoy this, and I hope you, if not buy the book, get your library to get a copy.